Down, incoming from the ridge. The shout tore through the frozen trench line east of Leningrad, February 1943. Snow burst upward as German shells slammed into the Soviet positions, shaking the ground hard enough to rattle teeth. Most of the Red Army conscripts ducked instantly, but one man didn't. Andreas Meyer stayed upright longer than he should have, his eyes fixed on the distant German guns. The blasts were familiar, the timing, the angle, even the pauses between volleys. He had once known these patterns the way a mechanic knows the sound of his own tools, because he had once fought with the men firing at him. Rumors traveled fast through these trenches. Soldiers whispered that Meyer was different, quiet, precise, a man who carried himself like someone trying very hard not to remember who he used to be. But memory doesn't go away on the Eastern Front. It comes back with every explosion. Another shell landed closer. Dirt rained over the trench. A Soviet corporal grabbed Andreas by the sleeve. "You want to get killed? Get down!" Andreas finally dropped to one knee, but his gaze stayed locked on the horizon where the smoke rose in dark columns. He wasn't supposed to be here, and certainly not facing the same army he'd once marched with. 2 years earlier, he had worn a very different uniform. Late summer of 1941. The German advance toward the Soviet Union was still roaring forward. Andreas had been a 22-year-old private in the 121st Infantry Division, marching through the Baltic states with the same confidence that swept through much of the Wehrmacht. He wasn't ideological, he wasn't ambitious, just another mechanic's apprentice turned soldier, following orders in a war he didn't understand. By January 1942, that confidence froze solid on the shores of Lake Ilmen. The German winter gear had failed. Supplies were cut. Soviet counterattacks struck harder than anyone expected. Andreas's unit tried to retreat across the frozen lake under artillery fire. The ice didn't hold. He remembered the sound first, a deep crack beneath the snow. Then the screams. Then the plunge into black water as half his battalion vanished under the ice. The Soviet troops who surrounded the survivors didn't speak. They simply disarmed the shivering men and marched them toward improvised detention camps. Andreas assumed he would die there like so many others, but fate didn't follow the usual path. Inside a makeshift holding site near Staraya Russa, a Soviet officer noticed something unusual about him. Andreas could speak basic Russian, not well, but enough to follow orders, enough to answer questions, enough to be useful. That single detail changed everything. He was moved again, this time not with the mass of prisoners, but with a smaller group sent for re-education and labor assignment. There were no promises, just long, silent lectures about fascism, survival, and the Soviet state's expectations. Some POWs resisted, some pretended to listen, some saw the writing on the wall. Andreas didn't resist, didn't support, didn't believe. He just did what men do when freezing, starving, and cornered by the machinery of war. He stayed alive. One evening, a Red Army lieutenant called him out into the corridor. "You were a machinist?" "Yes." "You follow instructions?" "Yes." "You speak enough Russian?" "I try." The lieutenant nodded once, as if confirming a decision already made. "You'll be reassigned. Report at dawn." That was all. No explanation, no choices. At dawn, Andreas stood among a dozen former POWs being absorbed into the Trud Armee, Soviet labor battalions attached to frontline support units. The war machine needed bodies, and nobody was asking where those bodies came from anymore. During the rail transport westward, the men heard a rumor. Quiet at first, then spreading in uneasy whispers. They weren't being sent to some distant rear position. They were being redirected toward the Volkhov front, a place Andreas knew far too well. A place where he had once marched under the German flag, a place where he had been captured, a place waiting for him again. The train rumbled deeper into the cold night, and the realization sank in for Andreas with a weight heavier than any chain. He might soon find himself facing German soldiers who didn't know he had survived the lake, the camps, or the months of silence. Soldiers who would see him not as a defector or a forced recruit, but as a traitor, the kind they shot on sight. And ahead, the horizon glowed faintly with artillery flashes. The same rhythm he had learned as a German private. The same guns he understood better than the men standing next to him, and the same battlefield waiting to swallow him twice. Stepping back into the Volkhov sector felt like walking into an old photograph he never asked to pose for. The same charred treetops clawing at a gray sky, the same frozen marshland stiff as broken glass, the same distant rumble of German armor shifting before dawn. Nothing had really changed, except the uniform on Andreas's back and the men beside him who assumed he had always been one of them. The Trude Army detachment had been attached to a Soviet rifle regiment preparing for a push toward the German lines. The officers didn't look at Andreas twice. To them, he was just another quiet face in a sea of exhausted bodies. But the soldiers whispered when he passed. Stories traveled fast in the front-line mud. Some said he used to fight for the Germans. Others said he came from a village wiped off the map. A few insisted he had no past at all. Andreas kept his eyes down and his rifle close. The Volkhov cold had a way of punishing anyone who dared to remember who they used to be. Nights were the worst. The regiment slept in shallow dugouts patched with rotten planks. Frost crept over boots and blankets. Somewhere beyond the tree line, heavy artillery boomed like a giant breathing in and out. Every time Andreas closed his eyes, he saw the same thing. The German officer's face from that winter patrol, the one moment that destroyed the story he had spent years building. He wondered if this was fate's way of dragging him back to where everything had gone wrong. On the fourth day, orders arrived. A scouting run before dawn, a frozen river crossing, minimal visibility, high risk. Exactly the kind of job they gave to men whose lives didn't seem especially important. Andreas didn't argue. The squad moved through the trees like shadows stitched to the dark. Snow cracked under their boots. The river ahead shimmered in a thin sheet of moonlight, wide and silent. Somewhere on the opposite bank, machine gun nests waited under camouflage nets. When Andreas knelt to check the ice, he felt something stir inside him. Not fear. Something sharper. Something he thought he had thrown away the night he switched sides. He felt the old instincts waking up. He knew this terrain. He knew how the Germans would position their guns. He knew how they would listen for the faintest scrape of metal or clothing. He also knew exactly how to slip through their lines. For the first time since joining the Trude Army, he raised his head and spoke with authority. "Don't cross here. The ice is too thin. There's a drainage channel beneath it. Move 200 meters west." The others hesitated, surprised that the quiet man had a voice. But they followed him. And when the first machine gun burst ripped through the original crossing point, shredding the ice into a halo of shattered glass, no one questioned him again. Something had changed. For Andreas, and for the war he thought he had escaped. The sun never really rose on the Volkhov front. It just smeared a weak, colorless light across the sky, like someone had given up halfway through painting the day. By the time Andreas and his squad crawled back into the Soviet lines, the officer in charge had already heard the story. The quiet one, the one who never talked, the one who somehow knew exactly where the Germans were waiting. Now they were looking at him differently, not with trust, but with calculation. 2 hours later, he was summoned to a command dugout that smelled of wet wool, kerosene, and desperation. Maps hung from the walls like wounded animals. A major with heavy eyelids studied Andreas the way a hunter studies tracks. "You anticipated the ambush," the major said. "Explain." Andreas kept his posture stiff. "I've seen the Germans set up positions like that before." The major's eyes narrowed. "Serving where?" There it was, the question that could break everything open. Andreas swallowed the truth. "He offered just enough to survive. I worked logistics near Leningrad. Observation duties, nothing more." The major didn't believe him, but he didn't have better men to send, so he pushed a map across the table. "We need eyes on this ridge by nightfall. German artillery is adjusting. If we don't learn how many guns they've brought in, our regiment will be hit blind." The ridge was deep inside contested ground. A scouting mission like that was the kind where men were remembered with a one-line report and a shallow grave. Andreas studied the map anyway, the contour lines, the tree line breaks, the likely approach routes. It felt sickening, familiar, like slipping back into an old sin. "I'll go," he said quietly. The major looked relieved in that cold, bureaucratic way. "You'll take 2 men." "No," Andreas said before he could stop himself. "I go alone." The room froze. A soldier volunteering to go alone was unheard of, but Andreas couldn't afford witnesses, not if he had to move the way he once moved. The major gave a slow nod. "Very well. You leave at dusk." Crossing no man's land, the forest swallowed him as soon as he left the Soviet trenches. The snow muffled everything except his heartbeat, drumming too loudly against his ribs. The sky was turning violet, and the world smelled like cold iron. Step by step, he reclaimed the skills he'd buried. He read the terrain the way a thief reads silence. He listened for the rhythm of German patrols. He moved between tree shadows as if they were doors. Every minute brought him closer to the ridge, and closer to the truth he couldn't outrun. When he finally reached the top, he saw them. German artillery crews working in the open, adjusting elevation on fresh 105mm field guns. Trucks unloading crates of shells. Officers huddled over rangefinders. It was a full battery, enough to tear through the Soviet line like paper. And not just that. Among them stood an officer Andreas recognized instantly. The posture, the white scarf, the expression carved from ice. Captain Reinhard Keller. The man who had once trusted Andreas with his life. The man whose patrol Andreas had abandoned in the snow. The man who should have died that night. But he hadn't. And now he was staring across the ridge, directly toward Andreas's hiding place. For a moment, both men froze, separated by distance, war, and a single terrible memory. Keller's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol. Andreas didn't wait. He slipped backward into the trees, the German shouts rising behind him. He wasn't just scouting anymore. He had been recognized, and the past he thought he'd buried was now hunting him through the frozen woods. The forest came alive with German voices the moment Andreas disappeared into the trees. Not the panicked yelling of a scattered patrol. This was coordinated, precise. Keller's style. Branches slapped Andreas's face as he ran downhill, snow exploding under his boots. His lungs burned, but he kept moving. He knew exactly how Keller hunted. Fast, silent, methodical. The man didn't chase enemies. He pursued quarry. And Andreas had been his priority once. A loyal NCO, the man he'd trusted to guard his flank. The man who vanished in the night without a sound. No apology in the world would fix that. The gunfire started. Controlled bursts, testing distances, hurting him. Keller wasn't trying to kill him, not yet. He was trying to corner him. Andreas used every trick he remembered, cutting across frozen marshland where footprints vanished, doubling back along a fallen birch, sliding down a shallow ravine and crawling through thorns that bit like teeth. But Keller's men stayed close. Too close. The river. By the time Andreas reached the Volkhov River, the world behind him was glowing with German lanterns. The river was half frozen, a sheet of cracked white over black water. Crossing it meant gambling with death. Staying meant letting Keller catch him alive. Andreas stepped onto the ice. It groaned like an animal waking up. He moved slowly, spreading his weight, breath sharp and shallow. Halfway across, he heard it. Boots, dozens of them. Close, and one voice rising above the others, calm and furious at once. "Andreas!" Hearing his name felt like a bullet. It froze him. It hurt. He didn't turn around. If he looked at Keller's face, he'd break. The ice cracked, a long, splitting sound. Then a second crack. Then a third. Andreas sprinted the last 10 meters. The river surface spiderwebbed under him, fragments dipping like teeth. Just before the ice gave way, he hurled himself onto the opposite bank, rolling into a mess of snow and mud. Behind him, Keller stopped at the river's edge. The 2 men stared across the fractured white, breath rising like smoke. Keller didn't shout again, didn't threaten, didn't order a shot fired. He just looked at Andreas the way a man looks at a ghost he wasn't ready to see. Then the German officer raised a hand. A small, sharp salute. Not respect, not forgiveness. Recognition. Andreas felt something twist in his gut, something he had been running from since the night he deserted. Not guilt, not fear, the truth. He hadn't changed sides to survive. He had changed sides because he couldn't live with what he had become. Return to the red lines. Andreas staggered back into Soviet trenches at dawn, mud-covered, ice-bitten, barely breathing. The same major who sent him out stared at him like he expected a ghost, too. "You saw the guns?" the major asked. "Yes," Andreas said. "A full battery, 4 pieces, positioning to shell the left sector." The major nodded and turned to his aides. Orders began flying. But Andreas stayed quiet. He didn't mention Keller, didn't mention the name shouted across the river, didn't mention the salute. Some truths were too sharp to hand over. Epilogue of the encounter. That night, curled in a dugout lit by a single trembling candle, Andreas listened to distant artillery rolling like thunder. The Soviet counter-barrage had begun. He closed his eyes, but the river came back to him. The busted ice, the cold air, Keller's voice breaking years of silence. "Andreas, there were thousands of men on this front, millions across the whole war, but somehow, in all that chaos, fate had dragged 2 former comrades into the same frozen hell again, and neither of them would forget it."